madre cuando te parió y te quitó el mundo, corazón ella no te dio para amar segundo, corazón ella no te dio para amar segundo.
As part of the Balkan campaign in April 1941, Germany and its allies occupied and partitioned Yugoslavia. In Serbia, Nazi Germany established the military occupation administration, while Croatia became an independent state under the umbrella of German and Italian forces. Other areas of Yugoslavia were annexed by neighboring Axis countries, Hungary, Italy, and Bulgaria. Different occupation zones shaped the manner, circumstances, and chronology of the final solution in Yugoslavia. I will focus on the two largest parts of the pre-war Yugoslavia, Serbia and Croatia, independent state of Croatia during the war. There were about 16,000 Jews in Serbia living under German occupation. Jewish men were murdered in mass shootings in the proximity of Belgrade or in the fall of 1941. The Jews were disproportionately singled out as victims of German reprisals and draconian measures to quell the Serbian uprising against the occupation forces. The next stage of the final solution took place in the winter of 1941-1942, when women and children were taken to the Sajmište concentration camp established on the outskirts of Belgrade. By May 1942, they were either killed on site or in a moving van in which victims were suffocated to death with carbon monoxide. The Nazis murdered approximately 14,500 Jews, or 90% of the community. Serbia was officially announced Judenrein in August 1942. The final solution of Serbia and Croatian Jews is that they were mostly murdered in their own country and at a very early stage of the war. However, while in Serbia the murder was perpetrated by the German military authorities, in Croatia, it was committed without much German interference.
Hello, everyone. This is Jeffrey Geisner from the Jewish Culture and Holocaust October 7th Remembrance Stand Against Hate Communities. I'm thrilled to be talking today with Jordan Stephen Schur, who has domain expertise in the Holocaust in Yugoslavia, as well as the genocide in the Bosnian Wars. He's written 3 books, Dark Shadows Hover, and also his other books, which is In Still We Rise and Surviving the War in Bosnia. And we'll be just talking about those books in a later film. So welcome, Jordan. Glad to have you.
Well, thank you very much. I live actually in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I've been here for 26 years. Prior to that, lived in San Diego, and prior to that, I grew up on Long Island in New York and went to undergrad and graduate school in upstate New York. I was brought up in a conservative Jewish family. The Holocaust was never too far from our memory and our fears about what had happened, what could happen again in the future. But I got a master's in social work, ended up working in nonprofit for 22 years, then got a teaching credential later in life and taught middle school. And it was at that point, the last year I was teaching a school that had 99% of its students from Mexico and Central America. That was during the first Trump administration. And the students were very worried that ICE would be visiting their families and taking their parents away. And I'd had it, being second-generation American Jew, understanding that most of us who've come to this country are immigrants, right? Except for the native people who lived here. I wrote a book called Our Neighbors, Their Voices. That's hard, because I interviewed 12 people from different countries, including Mexico, Guatemala, Iran, Vietnam, Ethiopia, Cyprus, and other places, I interviewed people who had emigrated from their country to the US to prove that these are folks, most people who come here, are not looking to commit crime, okay, as had been stated by some, in politics. And I met two women who were children during the war in Bosnia in the 1990s. Both of them were 7 years old. Both of them had to flee for their lives with their parents. I knew nothing about Bosnia or the war in Bosnia and the genocide that was committed there. And it got me to wonder, if I don't know much about what happened in the war in the 90s, I wonder how many others do. And I have, friends who are certainly relatives who are educated. They didn't understand or know much about what happened.
From 1992 to 1995, Bosnia and Herzegovina was the scene of one of the darkest chapters in modern history, the Bosnian Genocide. The conflict erupted as the country declared independence from Yugoslavia, sparking violent ethnic tensions. Bosnian Serb forces, with the backing of the Yugoslav army, launched a campaign of ethnic cleansing against Bosniak, Bosnian Muslim, and Croatian civilians. Over 100,000 people lost their lives, and millions were displaced. The world watched in horror as atrocities like the Srebrenica massacre unfolded. After the war, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia prosecuted key figures responsible for these crimes.
So I wrote the two books that you'd mentioned earlier, historical fiction, and one is nonfiction, where I interviewed a number of people who survived that war. Now, in the women who I interviewed for my first book, who were children at the time, and the people I interviewed for surviving the war in Bosnia, all of them lost numerous relatives during the war. All of them fled to the US. And then I got to wondering, after And Still We Rise, what happened to Jews during the Holocaust in Yugoslavia? I really didn't have much information.
The country consists of 6 constituent republics: Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, and Macedonia. Vojvodina and Kosovo are defined as autonomous provinces of Serbia. The Communist Party also leaves the choice of official language to the individual regions.
Imagine. But take a second and think about this. During World War II, there was a camp in the former Yugoslavia that a Holocaust survivor and historian called worse than even Auschwitz in terms of brutality. It might surprise you, but the Germans did not run this extermination camp, and it was the 3rd largest concentration camp in Europe during the war in terms of area. Today, we are going to tell you the story of fascist Croatian Ustasha and the brutal concentration camp system they built and ran, including the notorious Jasenovac camp complex, a place so brutal that their Nazi allies pressured the Croats clean it up or close it. One of the many problems between the many groups in Yugoslavia was that for centuries, they had been dominated and ruled by other nations, kingdoms, and people. In Croatia, the dominant Christian sect was and is Catholicism. At times, a fervent, sometimes zealous Catholicism. In Serbia, the dominant sect is Eastern Orthodoxy, also practiced in Russia and Greece. From 1941 to 1945, Croatia was ruled by the fascist Ustasha. In 1929, Pavelić formed the Ustasha Croatian Revolutionary Organization, which adopted many of the policies of Mussolini's fascist Italy, as well as some of its symbols. Pavelić and his supporters, like Mussolini and Hitler when they began, were not a majority in Croatia in 1929, or even through the 1930s. But as things got worse in Europe and both Germany and Italy seemed invincible, many more Croats began to join. Like Italy, Germany, and even France, just before the war, Croatia began to divide along lines of extremes. The Ustasha and other ultra-nationalists on one side, and Croatian socialists and communists on the other. Shortly after its founding, however, the platform of Pavelić and the Ustasha rested on these 4 things. That Croatia was for Croatians only. That Catholicism was the sole religion of Croatia itself, but that Islam in Bosnia was acceptable as it brought order to the region. That Serbs, Jews, and the Roma people were inferior. It needed to be either expelled from Croatia or killed, and that the nation of Croatia should include Bosnia-Herzegovina and parts of Slovenia and Serbia. On top of all that, Croatia was to be a one-party state with the Ustasha in power with Pavelić, known as the Poglavnik, or supreme leader. Even before the first German extermination camp at Chelmno, Poland, was built in December 1941, extermination camps were functioning on the territory of the NDH. The first camp, Jadovno, was built in May 1941 and operated for only just over 3 months. In that time, thousands of Serbs and Croatian Jews were killed. Estimates run from 10,000 to nearly 70,000. Numbers are hard to come by, as most of the killings took place far from sight, and the victims were never counted.
The Al-Bahari family were deported to this collection camp, and they were put into a space that had been used as a toilet. And they had very little room. They had some sweaters and some blankets, and they laid on the floor, and there wasn't much in the way of food. It was really very difficult for anybody living there, as you can imagine, being taken from your home. Now, there were 30 collection camps in the independent state of Croatia. And like I said, these camps were, certainly they were barbed wired, they were poor conditions. The Al-Bahari family, the son knew bits and pieces, but primarily Morris would say to him when asked by Dado, and that's the son's nickname he goes by, Dado would ask Morris, can you tell me about what it was like for you during the Holocaust? He was a partisan, and he'd say, you don't want to know. In October of 1941, all the Jews in this collection camp, including, of course, the Al-Baharis, were to be transported to Jasenovac. And as I mentioned, Jasenovac is a death camp. But because the people had in the camp, the inmates, the prisoners, could not wait to leave the collection camp. They didn't know that Jasenovac was a death camp. They were somewhat relieved because they were leaving the collection camp. When they got on these transport trucks, they were taken to, and there's other incidents along the way, but they're eventually taken to a train platform, a train station, and they're put into cattle cars. And what should have just been, a few-hour trip, basically, took 10 hours to get to a city called Prijedor in northwest Bosnia. Now, the Al-Baharis knew Prijedor because they had friends and they had some relatives in the area. But the reason it stopped in Prijedor was because train tracks going beyond Prijedor to Jasenovac had to be repaired. Now, mind you, in these cattle cars, it took 10 hours. There was no food, no water, small window that let very little oxygen, very little air in. They had to relieve themselves in the cattle cars. It was awful, of course. And all of the cattle cars, because it wasn't just people from Morris and his family's collection camp, they were told to throw out their dead. The doors were open slightly. They really didn't know why they were in Prijedor. They didn't know until they did learn that the tracks had to be repaired. But the cattle car doors were opened, and they were told to throw out their dead, which they did. And at night, the Ustasha, who would pretty much be there at night, were drunk. And so they didn't notice that few at a time would leave the cattle cars and go into Prijedor and knock on doors and get food. They didn't want to leave because if they went into the forest nearby, they knew that there were German soldiers, there were Ustasha, there was Croatian home guards who they could have been killed that way. The people had in the camp, the inmates, the prisoners, could not wait to leave the collection camp. They didn't know that Jasenovac was a death camp. Back of the train platform in the rear, a man is yelling to Mladić, and actually yelling to a soldier who was nearby, bring that boy to me. and it was Monich. And they turned around, they saw it was Monich's former music teacher in Durvar. So Monich goes back to where the music teacher is, and the teacher gives him a sandwich and some water and an iron bar, like a crowbar, and says, put this in your pants and hide it. And when you get back onto the train car, the cattle car, give it to your father. And tonight, you tell him tell him that you're going to lower yourself down, face down on the tracks, wait till the train leaves. And the music teacher said, and I will be back and take you to safety. So this Italian colonel, he knows Monich is Jewish, and he takes him to the home of an Orthodox Christian Serb family who, at that point, the Serbs were still allowed to live. In fact, it was Durvar again, where Monich had originally been from. So he takes him to this family, and the colonel says, well, first of all, you need to change your name, change your identity, so that you're not identified as Jewish. So he takes on a pseudonym, Monich does. And for a couple of months, the colonel says, every day I want you to come to this cafe. My soldiers are there. They're going to get you warm bread and treats and coffee and those things. So he would go there, and they sort of almost adopted him. These soldiers did. So he was treated well. And the family he lived with treated him quite well. Now, again, he didn't know where his family was. That was a constant concern and constant worry for him. But after 2 months of living there, the colonel said to Monich, you need to leave because the Germans are going to be coming to Durvar any day now. He escapes into the mountains, and he's there for several weeks. And he identified him as a wolf alone in the woods, and he sort of felt like that. He was quite alone at 12. And he survived on, because he was there for a number of weeks, winter grasses, berries. The colonel had given him a pair of binoculars. So he would go to the edge of the forest when he was wandering to different villages to see if they were controlled by the partisans or the Germans. If they were the partisans, he'd go into the village, knock on doors, and get food. After several weeks, and again, I'm just amazed how he survived, a partisan patrol sees this sleeping boy. They wake him up, and he's stunned, and they essentially say to him, come with us, because if you stay out here, you will eventually die. Come with us, and you can join our movement, our resistance movement. And they take him back to their camp. It's actually a couple hours away. And from there, we see what kind of experience, learn about what kind of experience Monich had as a partisan.
In the shadow of World War II, Europe's largest resistance force emerged from the mountains of Yugoslavia. The Yugoslav partisans, led by Josip Broz Tito, grew to 800,000 strong, fighting against overwhelming odds. While initially small-scale saboteurs, by 1941 they boldly established the liberated Užice Republic in Serbia. As Nazi forces launched 7 major offensives to crush them, the partisans survived the brutal battles of Neretva and Sutjeska in 1943, coming perilously close to annihilation. Their revolutionary vision of a socialist Yugoslavia united fighters across ethnic divides, creating a resistance so formidable that Hitler was forced to divert precious resources from other fronts to combat them.
He met and became friends with a few of the other partisans who were teenagers. They were older than him, but he trusted them. He didn't trust everyone. And then eventually he did find other folks, other comrades, I guess, that he trusted. But he was given the roles of photographer and courier or messenger. And he had never owned a camera in his life, had no idea what to do with it. But he was trained on how to use the camera. And the reason that there were numerous photographers throughout the partisans was for propaganda reasons and for recruiting new members of to the partisans. He learned to take photographs of victories, the triumphant return of his comrades from battle, or just them relaxing and resting, or maybe even having more joyous times. The partisans sang a lot of songs, a lot of sort of songs from the Spanish Civil War, for example. And so they tried to keep their morale up, and Mladic would take photographs of them. And it sort of became a refuge for him. When he could develop the photos, which was not often because they were moving a great deal in battles, it was sort of his refuge to get into a dark room and develop them. So he eventually became quite expert at it. However, he was never able to keep any of the photos because they were property of the Tito and his fellow leaders, was property in the partisans. And Dado, his son, found some of the diary pages. In one of the pages, he talks about how really depressed and lonely he feels. In one of the pages, he talks about, today is my bar mitzvah, but there is no celebration. So he does note these in his diary pages, and it's pretty fascinating. I was able to take some of those diary pages and create stories, or scenes really, for my book, because there was nobody who was with him that I could ever find as a boy. So I had to create based on what Dado told me, based on the diary pages. But in one scene that's in my book, he has a mission. He has to go 20 kilometers to deliver a message to another commander. And on the way back, he looks up in the sky and he sees this British Halifax airplane, huge airplane. And he sees pilot soldiers parachuting from the plane, and he looks over and the plane crashes into a nearby mountain and explodes. So Mladic, by the way, his nickname was Machi, which meant wildcat. That saved him, his ability to do that. But Machi races over to see about these soldiers who parachuted down. They pull out their guns because they don't know who he is. And so he drops his backpack, and he raises his hand, and March spoke a little German, and so he says, "Sprechen Sie Deutsch," and a little Italian, parla Italiano, and none of the soldiers do. But then he speaks Ladino.
Ladino, the language of the Sephardic Jews. Originally, Ladino was born after the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492. In exile, it spread across communities of the Ottoman Empire. Over time, it blended Old Spanish with Hebrew, Turkish, Arabic, and Greek. In daily life, it was used to speak, sing, pray, and tell stories. At home, the language passed down through generations. In writing, people used either Hebrew or Latin script. In the 20th century, the Holocaust and assimilation endangered it. Today, it still lives on in some Sephardic families. Thanks to them, artists and scholars are helping it revive. Through its resilience, Ladino remains a symbol of identity and memory.
Sort of getting towards the end of our interview, approached the fact that you were just back in country in June, and perhaps you can tell your audience why you decided to take a trip out of the country, especially with the political state as it is.
I was giving a virtual presentation in mid-May to a Sephardic group in Washington, D.C. There happened to be a cantor in the audience, and I learned that she was leading a tour group to both Jewish and non-Jewish sites in Croatia and Bosnia. Now, I had spent a number of years before learning about Bosnia, learning about both the war in the 90s, and then more recently, for Dark Shadows Hover, about the Holocaust. It was almost like my calling in the Balkans. It certainly being there exceeded expectations about what I would feel, what I would learn, and and what an emotional experience it was for me to actually be there.
And when you went on the group, how did they use your expertise?
So I did not want to sort of supersede the tour guide's expertise. But I was able to contribute and add to what the tour guide was explaining to us as a group when it was appropriate, to add, more sort of my personal knowledge from what I had learned and the people I had spoken with to his or her explanation, depending on the city we were in. There were different tour guides. At one point, we're on the bus and someone asked, because we took a chartered bus, and one of the people in the tour group asked if I could talk to them about the war in the 90s. So it was really, like I said, for me, more just a very, deeply emotional, personal experience to be there.
La tierra, el fuego, la agua y el aire, cantaremos más. Al fondo de nuestras almas, milagros nos llevan a la alegría. El misterio se reveló con la dulzor del Criador, que podamos ver la valor después de toda la dolor. El misterio se reveló con la dulzor del Criador, que podamos ver la valor después de toda la dolor.
Most profound was going to Jasenovac, for one. It was when you're walking through from this museum, you walk about a mile, and on the right-hand side is a replica of the transport, the cattle car that took its victims really to Jasenovac. And when you're walking, it's almost like a boardwalk, but it's the railroad ties that were used for the tracks for this transport. And I'm walking on this, going towards this, like I said, lotus blossom statue or a sculpture that was, like I said, about 60 feet high. And I'm thinking about, this looks so pastoral. There's a huge field, there's a pond, and you see the sculpture, and that's it. And I have not been to other concentration camps. I've been to Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, but never the concentration camps where, the buildings remain, the gas chamber remains, the barracks remain, the huts. But this didn't. It was just that sculpture. And it really left me with, in my own understanding what happened, in my own mind, that these murders took place here. So that was profound. And the other was meeting Ella, Morris's widow, and Dado in person, and going to Morris's apartment in Sarajevo, where Ella still lives. And went to see the outer wall of their apartment had bullet holes, and it had actually been, the wall was partially collapsed by a tank shell. I think it was a tank shell or grenade during the 90s war. It's partially repaired, but there's still bullet holes. Just seeing all of this and knowing what happened, as I mentioned earlier, was quite profound.
That's my town, Sarajevo. You can see here old tile Sarajevo, and the left side is new Sarajevo. Before Second World War, in that style live Christians, Muslims, and much Hebrew people, the synagogue, much family Jews. On the right side is Alifakovac, where I am. Here, much families Jewish. Cordoba is first region leave the Spain and gone in Venezia.
Dawno przez sadie krajem.
That's old synagogue and left side. In Ladino language, Alcal Nuevo, new synagogue. And before Second World War, when I be child with my mother and father, I visit for Shabbat that synagogue. No. Oh my God, my heart is yours. That's Cortijo, you know. That is one garden where after Inquisition live together all Sephardim, not ghetto. We are free, but like ghetto, live together here. Before in 16th centuries, here was homes with apartments, deal apartments for Jewish family here all, and that synagogue. This building is Jewish school, Hebrew school for learning for young people, and upstairs is seminar for rabbis. Every Sunday we visit here to learn, pray to God, like young people. Now is not Hebrew school, now is another offices because not Hebrew, not school. That's my school in Ladino Maldar. Before Holocaust, here was mezuzah, but now not. But I kiss a wall without mezuzah. Before war, with me, 3 sisters, my uncle. That's one family, you know, very large. And in Alifakovac, we are all together, one home, another home from my uncle, and about 37 members. We are together for Shabbat, for holidays. We are all together for people, for child, and we have one song. Give me, Echu Muna in Ladino. Echu Muna Bombonica. Put out one bonbon for me. Echu una bombonicha para mí. Echu una bombonicha para mí. Every morning we sing that and open window and put out switches.
Soles lluvias y montañas por aires han sido